Lord, you can do it. You can sovereignly, supernaturally force the Pharaoh of Hamas, the Pharaoh of Gaza, to let our people go. And that's what we're praying, and we should not give up. Again, we don't know how many of these hostages are even alive at this point, but we must not give up. With millions of evangelical Christians around the world praying for God to set the captives free, are we about to see a new deal with Hamas releasing hostages and maybe getting close to the end of this war? Are the Saudis about to make an historic peace with Israel? And what are new polls in the United States telling us about how Americans see Israel and its war on multiple fronts, including with Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas? Hi, this is Joel Rosenberg in Jerusalem with a YouTube exclusive for the Rosenberg Report. There is growing hope here in Israel that a new hostage deal may in fact be close. President Biden spoke this week with Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, to brief him on the latest round of negotiations. Secretary of State Tony Blinken also arrived in Israel on Wednesday to brief Netanyahu and Israeli President Isaac Herzog in person on those very sensitive and time-consuming negotiations. Let me make it clear, the deal is not yet done as I record this. Talks could break down at any moment, but there is a growing sense of hope. I would say we went from about, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being metaphysical certitude that we would get the hostages out, or most of them, or many of them. We were at about a 1, I would say, a week ago. And now I think we're maybe at a 6 or 7, maybe moving towards an 8. It doesn't mean it's all going to happen. It just means there's a growing cautious sense of optimism that the deal is about to happen. Now, let me show you the contours of the negotiations as best as we can tell from leaks that are being reported in the Israeli, Arab, and American media, including, of course, at All Israel News. First, we are getting the sense that Hamas is willing to release living hostages. Some reports are saying as few as 20, others are saying 33, others are saying as many as 40. Obviously, we don't know yet, but the idea that Hamas seems to be ready to release some, maybe several dozen living hostages is important. Let me also note on that point, there's a real question that Israelis are talking amongst themselves. How many of the 133 Israelis and internationals that are, they're still in Gaza, how many of them are alive? And we actually don't know that. Is it possible that if Hamas releases 20 or 33 or 40, that's it, that's all the living hostages there are? We actually don't know, so please keep praying, because that's an enormous point of concern, of pain for Israeli hostage families, and of course for the country as a whole. Second, we are seeing in these leaks that Israel seems willing to release Palestinian prisoners to get these hostages out. Some reports are saying as few as 700 Palestinian prisoners would be released. Others are saying about 1,000. Again, we don't know precise numbers yet, but that's what is being discussed here. Let's keep praying. The third major piece that seems to be coming out in Israeli and American and Arab media is that the IDF would agree to pause fighting in Gaza. Some are saying for as many as 40 days, so it'll be about 5 or 6 weeks. So is that accurate? Again, we're going to have to keep track of that, and I'll keep reporting about it at All Israel News and, of course, on the Rosenberg Report. But that's the contours, as best as we can tell, of the deal as it stands. Now, Secretary Tony Blinken, as I mentioned, is here in Israel as I record this, but he was just in Saudi Arabia. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that Secretary Blinken is telling reporters that prospects for a groundbreaking peace and normalization deal between Israel and the Saudis is actually growing. Okay? We haven't talked much for the last 6 months about the possibility of an Israeli-Saudi breakthrough, joining the Abraham Accords or something even much larger. Why? Well, because the fighting has been so intense and the Arab world has been so hostile to Israel, the idea that the Saudi government would make peace in the middle of this intense war between Israel and Palestinians in Gaza seems so unlikely that people just mostly stopped talking about it. But the fact that Blinken has just come from Saudi Arabia, from meeting with senior officials there, and that he's publicly saying that he's getting more and more optimistic that a deal with Israel and the Saudis is possible, possibly before the end of the year, before even the election. Blinken is also saying that the U.S. is getting closer to finalizing a bilateral defense agreement between the United States and the Saudis, as well, and as part of that is a deal that would allow the Saudis to build their own peaceful civilian nuclear program with American assistance. Now, let's now look at a fascinating new poll on how Americans see Israel today with all of these attacks and all this mess on college campuses, which we reported on the Rosenberg Report last week, and it's getting worse in the United States. But let's look at how Americans see Israel and the war that it's fighting on multiple fronts. Interestingly enough, a new Harvard poll conducted with Harvard and the Harris Organization, conducted right at the end of April, shows very positive news on how Americans see Israel. And so I want to just walk you through some of the key takeaways from this poll. So let's start with the first of those key takeaways. 80% of Americans, 80%, 8 in 10 of Americans support Israel in its war with Hamas. That's astonishing, right? Because with all the things that we're seeing that are so hostile, so negative, that is really encouraging news that 80% of Americans are standing with Israel, especially when we're not talking about a poll taken by some right-wing or pro-Israel organization. Harvard is not pro-Israel, but their numbers are very interesting. Here's another factoid. 56% of Americans, more than half, supported the $26 billion aid package that Congress just passed and President Biden just signed that provides more arms and ammunition for Israel on an emergency basis in this war, as well as humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. 56%. That's encouraging. 72% of Americans think that Israel should move forward with a military operation in Rafah, the southernmost city in Gaza, to finish this war. Okay, that's an amazing percentage because it says that Americans are paying enough attention that even though President Biden has told us don't do it, much of the world has told us don't go into Rafah, and people have sounded all kinds of worst case scenarios, most Americans, significantly large numbers of majority of Americans do think that Israel should win the war by finishing off destroying the Hamas infrastructure and the final, brigades of Hamas fighters, terrorists in Rafah. So that's encouraging. Another point, 67% of Americans think that Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties in the fighting. 67%. So 2 out of 3 Americans say, no, Israel is trying hard to protect Palestinian civilians, and only a third believe otherwise. 61% of Americans say they support a ceasefire only after the release of all the hostages and that Hamas is removed from power. That's really interesting, and we're going to look at more of that in a moment, but that's interesting that Americans want, of course they want there to be peace, they want there to be a ceasefire, they want the war to end. Every Israeli wants the war to end. They want their sons and daughters to come home from the army, and for us, but they don't want to lose. They don't want to surrender. I don't want to surrender, and that's critical. And so what we're finding is more than 6 in 10 Americans are saying, yeah, Israel should not surrender. They should win, and then they can stop fighting. Amen. 80% of Americans, 80%, think that Iran is a danger to the United States and that it must be stopped from getting nuclear weapons. That is very, very encouraging. Again, we have seen so much effort by people who oppose Israel that Iran's really not such a big threat, don't worry about it. But I think the recent attack just reminded Americans what they know in their gut, which is the Iranian regime is evil, and they need to be stopped. Now, only 33% of Americans believe that it's possible to negotiate a deal with Iran to stop it from obtaining nuclear weapons. Only 33%. But that's the Biden approach, right? Biden, and going back before when President Biden was Vice President Biden and he was working with then President Barack Obama, they were convinced that you could negotiate an effective deal with the Iranian regime, no matter how much Iran lies, it didn't seem to matter to Obama and Biden, you could make a deal. And they did in 2015. And of course, Netanyahu and most Israelis were against that deal. The deal did not work. Iran continued to cheat, lie, cheat, and steal, and continued on its effort to build nuclear weapons. Then when Biden came back into office, he again tried to negotiate a new deal. Fortunately, it was the Iranians who said no. They just saw Biden as so weak that why should they sign anything with Biden? But I think it's interesting that most Americans do not think that negotiating some sort of deal on paper is going to be effective in stopping Iran from getting the bomb. Fully 67% of Americans, 2 out of 3 Americans, believe that the best way to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons is to place more sanctions, tougher sanctions, economic sanctions on them, isolate the Iranian regime, and create a heavy cost on the Iranian regime for pursuing such weapons. I am definitely in that camp. I do not believe that this is a group of people that you can negotiate with, or if you do, they're not going to keep the deal anyway. So we've got to apply the same type of maximum pressure campaign that President Trump did and was quite successful in during his 4 years in office. This was interesting. 67% of Americans, 2 out of 3, say that NATO countries have a responsibility to support Israel against Iranian aggression. That's really interesting. And this includes 71% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans. This is fascinating because we did see when Iran fired 320 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and suicide drones at us just a few weeks ago. What did the U.S. do? It mobilized a coalition, not just of Israel and our fighter jets and our missile defense systems, but also the Jordanians and the Bahrainis and the not the Emiratis, but the Saudis and the French and the British. And so it's interesting that the British and French were actively involved in helping shoot down those missiles and suicide drones that were coming at Israel. And this is not a NATO region, right? This is not the North Atlantic. This is the Middle East. Now, this is interesting too. The Harvard pollsters also tested 2 different questions to see how people would respond. And they actually say in their press release that it's they're testing the question of fake news or a fake poll result. What they mean is they asked the same type of question 2 different ways to show that depending on how you word a question, you can get very different results. So the first version they said was, do you favor or oppose a permanent ceasefire in Gaza? 70% of Americans said yes, they support a permanent ceasefire in Gaza. 30% said no, they don't support that. Now, if you just ask the question that way and you just release that poll number, it would make it look like that the White House or State Department, the UN, anybody else in the world who was forcing Israel to accept a permanent ceasefire without winning would have the support of 70% of Americans. But the Harvard-Harris poll shows that that's not actually true. They asked it again in a slightly different way. Question number 2, would you favor or oppose that same ceasefire if it meant that Hamas was allowed to continue to hold hostages and that Hamas were to continue to run Gaza? And the whole situation reversed. When you ask them if you get a permanent ceasefire in which Hamas wins and is still in charge, 68% of Americans oppose such a permanent ceasefire, and only 32% would support it. This is why it's important as we defend the U.S. relationship with Israel, when we defend our allies in Israel, and of course as I defend my own country, it's important to make it clear. Do we all want the end of this war? Of course we do. That is not the question. There's nobody who wants this war to go on and on and on, ad infinitum. The question is, at what cost? And obviously, Israelis, we want our hostages back, we want Hamas to be vanquished, and we want Hamas not to be in charge at all in any way, shape, or form when this war is over in Gaza, much less, of course, we don't want them in charge of the West Bank either. And that has the support of 7 in 10 Americans, and that is encouraging. Therefore, we as evangelical Christians need, by the millions, to keep praying and pleading with the Lord based on Isaiah 61, 1 and 2. Lord, set the captives free, comfort the grieving, comfort those who are mourning, and bring good news, right? Lord, you can do it. You can sovereignly, supernaturally force the Pharaoh of Hamas, the Pharaoh of Gaza, to let our people go. And that's what we're praying, and we should not give up. Again, we don't know how many of these hostages are even alive at this point, but we must not give up. We have to keep pressing for their release and for a full victory over Hamas. Thank you so much for watching this YouTube exclusive. Please continue to watch the Rosenberg Report every Thursday night, prime time, and of course repeated on Saturday nights. Continue to go to rosenbergreport.tv, where you can sign up for free updates on the weekly shows and shows that you've missed. And of course, thank you for subscribing to our YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed, please do. And please share this link with friends and family on social media, that they could learn more about what's happening as well. From Jerusalem, this is Joel Rosenberg with a YouTube exclusive for the Rosenberg Report.